7:10 in the morning. The Barents Sea. An American RC-135 Rivet joint moved through the freezing air at 30,000 feet. This mission was supposed to be a standard collection flight. It was not. For the first time in 3 decades of patrols, the Russian response was completely silent. The crew in the back of the aircraft watched their screens. There were no radar spikes. There were no radio warnings from the Russian base at Severomorsk. The question was not if the Russians were coming. The question was why they were choosing to remain invisible. The sky over the Arctic was a pale and bruised purple. Below the aircraft, the dark water of the Barents Sea was visible through gaps in the cloud layer. It was a cold and lonely place for a mechanical failure or a diplomatic incident. The Rivet joint is a massive electronic intelligence platform. It is designed to hear everything. It can detect a radio transmission from hundreds of miles away. It can track the smallest pulse of a surface-to-air missile radar. Today, the sensors were quiet. Major Miller sat in the left seat of the cockpit. He adjusted the flight trim and looked out at the horizon. The air was perfectly still. It was the kind of atmospheric stability that pilots usually appreciate. To Miller, it felt like the breath before a scream. The mission commander spoke over the internal headset. "Pilot, recon. We have a clean sweep on the sensors. There are no active emitters in the sector." Miller responded. "Copy. Recon. It is too quiet. Keep the cameras moving." 10 miles to the east, something moved. It did not use radar. It did not use a radio. It was a Su-57 stealth fighter. This was the most advanced interceptor in the Russian inventory. It was painted in a digital camouflage pattern that blurred into the gray clouds. The Russian pilot was Captain Volkov. He did not look at his digital displays. He looked through the glass of his canopy. He was flying manually. He was hunting by sight alone. His mission was simple. He was to close the distance without being detected by the American sensors. Volkov adjusted his throttle. The twin engines of the Su-57 pushed the fighter toward the American plane. He was closing at 500 knots. The American crew still had no idea he was there. Their screens remained empty. The technological edge of the United States Air Force was being bypassed by a pilot using his eyes. It was a primitive solution to a high-tech problem. It was also incredibly dangerous. Inside the back of the Rivet joint, a technician frowned at his monitor. He adjusted a dial. He checked his power levels. Everything looked normal. Yet, he felt a strange pressure in his ears. It was not the cabin altitude. It was something else. It was a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. The technician spoke into his microphone. "Pilot. Recon. I have a visual. Starboard side. Level." The voice was sharp. It was urgent. Miller turned his head to the right. A shadow appeared out of the haze. It was sleek and flat. It looked like a predator from a deep ocean. The Su-57 drifted into view less than 100 meters away. It had come out of nowhere. No alarms had sounded. No warnings had tripped. No warnings had tripped. The Russian fighter did not bank away. It did not perform a warning barrel roll. It simply sat there. It was a ghost made of titanium and radar-absorbent paint. Miller gripped the control yoke. His knuckles were white. He could see the Russian pilot clearly. He could see the helmet and the oxygen mask. The 2 aircraft were now locked in a formation over the middle of nowhere. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 7:17 in the morning. The Barents Sea. Captain Volkov looked through the reinforced glass of his cockpit. The American aircraft was a wall of dull metal against the sky. It was massive. It was slow. To a fighter pilot, it looked like a building with wings. He adjusted the thrust of his twin engines with a tiny movement of his left hand. The Su-57 moved forward. It was not a jump, it was a slide. He closed the gap from 100 meters to 50, then 40. Finally, he leveled off at exactly 25 meters from the American wingtip. Inside the Russian cockpit, the flight computer remained dark. Volkov was flying by feel. He was matching the vibration of the RC-135. He was becoming a part of its formation. He could see the rivets on the American skin. He could see the sensors and the antennas that covered the fuselage like black needles. Volkov spoke into his internal recorder. "Distance is 25 meters. Visual on the target. The American crew is aware. They are holding steady. Inside the RC-135, the atmosphere changed. The hum in the cabin grew louder. It was a physical sensation now. It felt like a low-voltage current running through the floorboards. Major Miller looked out the side window. The Russian fighter was so close that it felt like he could reach out and touch it. The Su-57 was a masterpiece of engineering. It was flat and wide. It sat in the air with a predatory stillness. Miller spoke to his co-pilot. "He is too close. He is inside the safety buffer. Watch the wake turbulence." The co-pilot nodded. "He is not moving. He has matched our speed exactly. I have never seen a pilot hold a position this tight. It is like he is tethered to us." The American crew began their standard procedures for an intercept. They did not dive. They did not climb. Any sudden movement could cause a collision at this distance. They had to trust the skill of the Russian pilot. Miller keyed his radio. "Russian aircraft on my starboard wing. This is an American aircraft on a routine mission in international airspace. Your proximity is unsafe. Move to a distance of 2,500 meters." There was no answer. There was only static. Miller tried again on the international distress frequency. "Russian aircraft, you are standing into danger. Acknowledge." Again, there was nothing. The static on the radio was thick. It was not the sound of a bad connection. It was the sound of a wall of white noise. In the back of the aircraft, the electronic specialists were sweating. Their screens were beginning to flicker. The data they were collecting started to scramble. Lines of code turned into gibberish. The mission commander called the cockpit. "Pilot, we are losing the mission. Something is washing out our receivers." It is not coming from a ground station. It is coming from the interceptor. Miller looked at the Su-57 again. Captain Volkov was looking right back at him. The Russian pilot did not wave. He did not signal. He was as still as a statue behind his gold-tinted visor. Then, the Russian fighter did something unexpected. Volkov did not pull away. He began to slide his aircraft beneath the RC-135. He was moving into the blind spot directly under the American fuselage. Miller felt a shudder through the control yoke. "I lost visual. Where is he?" the mission commander shouted. "He is directly below the keel. 20 meters, 10 meters. He is hugging the belly of the plane." The two massive machines were now flying as one. The American plane was the shield. The Russian fighter was the shadow. The low-frequency hum intensified. It was no longer just a sound. The light in the cockpit began to dim. The sun was still high, but the interior of the plane was falling into a strange, artificial twilight. 7:25 in the morning. The shadow and the shield moved north. 7:27 in the morning. The Barents Sea. The cockpit of the American RC-135 felt smaller than it had 5 minutes ago. Major Miller adjusted his headset for the third time. The static was no longer a background hiss. It was a physical wall of sound. It pulsed with a rhythmic beat that matched the vibration in the floorboards. Miller spoke to his co-pilot. "Try the secondary channel. Use the guard frequency." The co-pilot shook his head. "I have already tried. Everything is washed out. It is not just the Russian pilot. We are not even picking up the civilian air traffic control from Norway. We are completely isolated." Miller looked at his primary flight display. The digital horizon was beginning to jitter. The lines blurred. Then, they snapped back into focus. It was a sign of extreme electromagnetic interference. Miller spoke into the radio. "Russian pilot, this is the United States Air Force. You are in our blind spot. Break away to the left. Acknowledge." Below the floor of the American plane, Captain Volkov sat in his Su-57. He was so close that he could see the individual oil streaks on the American fuselage above him. He was flying in a vacuum of his own making. The massive frame of the RC-135 was shielding him from the wind. It was also shielding him from the world. Volkov checked his own instruments. His radio was also dead. He had been ordered to maintain a silent intercept. He had not been ordered to lose all contact with his base. He looked up at the belly of the American plane. It looked like a vast metal ceiling. He felt a bead of sweat roll down his forehead. He did not wipe it away. He could not take his hands off the controls. At this distance, a 1-degree change in pitch would result in a catastrophic collision. He was a professional. He was one of the best pilots in the Russian Federation, but even he felt the weight of the moment. 7:30 in the morning. Severomorsk Air Base, Russia. General Sokolov stood in the darkened command center. He stared at the large tactical display on the wall. The two icons for the aircraft had merged into a single yellow dot. It flickered on the screen. Sokolov spoke to the radar operator. Report. Why are the tracks merged? The operator did not look up from his screen. General, the Su-57 is flying directly under the American. They are closer than 10 meters. I cannot separate them on the radar return. Sokolov leaned forward. Contact Volkov. Tell him to increase separation. This was a demonstration of capability. It is not a suicide mission. The operator shook his head. I cannot reach him. There is a massive spike of interference in the sector. It is blocking all communications. We have lost contact with the interceptor. Sokolov gripped the back of the operator's chair. The Americans will think he is attacking. If they try to maneuver, they will. Both go into the sea. 7:32 in the morning. Ramstein Air Base, Germany. The United States Air Forces in Europe Command Center was in a state of controlled panic. Analysts were staring at the same merged blip that Sokolov was watching in Russia. To the Americans, it looked like a forced boarding or a mid-air collision in progress. A colonel spoke into a secure phone. I need a status on the Rivet joint. Why are they silent? The voice on the other end was frantic. Sir, we lost the data link 30 seconds ago. The last transmission showed a Russian fighter closing to less than 25 meters. We have no audio, no telemetry. They are dark. The colonel looked at the clock. The president is being briefed in 5 minutes. If we do not have a voice on that radio, we have to assume the aircraft is lost. Back over the Barents Sea, the two planes moved as one. They were crossing an invisible line in the sky. Neither crew knew that. The electronic interference was about to get much worse. The low-frequency hum was changing. It was becoming a high-pitched whine. It was a sound that no human or machine was designed to withstand. The morning was cold. The tension was white-hot. 7:34 in the morning. The Barents Sea. The RC-135 was no longer flying alone. It was carrying a passenger of 10 tons of Russian steel. The massive American reconnaissance plane felt heavy in the air. The aerodynamics of the two aircraft were merging. The Su-57 was so close to the belly of the plane that the air between them was compressed into a solid block. Major Miller felt the vibration in his control column. It was a rhythmic shudder. It was the wake turbulence from the Russian fighter beneath him. It felt like a ghost was pulling on his hands. Every time Miller made a tiny correction to maintain his heading, the shadow below him matched it instantly. Miller spoke to his co-pilot. He is mirroring us. I am giving him 5 degrees of bank to the left. Watch his position. The co-pilot looked at the video feed from the belly camera. He is right there. He moved exactly with us. He is not using his flight computer for this. He is flying on pure instinct. It is a terrifying display of airmanship. Inside the Su-57, Captain Volkov was drenched in sweat. His flight suit was heavy. His breathing was loud in his oxygen mask. He was focused on a single point on the American fuselage. He used it as his reference. If that point moved an inch, Volkov moved an inch. He was trapped in the mirror. It was a high-stakes game of aerodynamic chicken. He was no longer a pilot. He was a component of a larger machine. His engines were screaming as they fought to maintain the exact speed of the slower American aircraft. The heat from his exhaust was washing over the American tail sensors. Volkov checked his fuel. He was burning it fast. The drag from being in the slipstream was immense. He knew he could not maintain this position for long, but his orders were clear. He was to stay on the American until they turned away from the restricted zone. 7:37 in the morning. The electromagnetic interference reached a new level. Inside the American plane, the technicians began to report equipment failures. The high-frequency radios were the first to go. Then the satellite data link dropped. The mission commander crawled forward to the cockpit. He had to yell to be heard over the rising hum in the cabin. "Major, we are losing everything. The cooling fans for the main computers just tripped. The racks are overheating. We have to break away." Miller looked at his primary flight display. It was a mess of flickering colors. "I cannot break away. If I dive, I hit him. If I climb, I might stall in his wash. We are locked together." The co-pilot pointed at the weather radar. "Look at the screen. That is not weather." The radar display was filled with a perfect circle of white noise. It was centered exactly on their position. It was moving with them. It was not a jammer. It was not a storm. It was an atmospheric anomaly that seemed to be feeding on the presence of the two aircraft. 7:40 in the morning. 200 miles away, a Norwegian radar station watched the single blip. The operator wiped his glasses. He called his supervisor. "Sir, the contact over the Barents Sea. It just changed." The supervisor leaned over. "Changed how?" The operator pointed at the digital readout. "The altitude is constant. The speed is constant." But the radar cross-section just tripled. "It is like the two planes have become one single object, and the signal is glowing. I have never seen a return this bright." Inside the planes, the hum was now a physical weight. It pressed against the eardrums of the crews. It vibrated in their bones. The air in the cockpits began to smell of ozone. It was the scent of a lightning strike before it happens. The two pilots looked out into the purple sky. They were no longer enemies. They were two men trapped in a mechanical nightmare. The morning was cold. The air was thick with a power they did not understand. 7:42 in the morning. The Barents Sea. Inside the Russian fighter, Captain Volkov was fighting his own machine. The flight controls were heavy and sluggish. The cockpit displays were a kaleidoscope of flashing red error messages. He could no longer see the American plane through his digital sensors. He could only see it through the glass of his canopy. Volkov believed the Americans were using a new type of electronic weapon against him. It felt like his brain was being vibrated out of his skull. The pressure in his chest was tightening. He had to end the encounter. He had to force the Americans to turn south and leave the restricted sector. He reached for the weapons control panel on his right console. He did not arm a missile for launch. Instead, he simply cycled the internal weapons bay doors. It was a classic move of high-stakes intimidation. It was a way of showing the American crew that the hunt was over. It was a signal that the kill was now an option. 7:43 in the morning. Inside the American plane, the mission commander stared at the small monitor for the belly camera. The image was grainy and heavily distorted by the electromagnetic interference. But the movement below the fuselage was unmistakable. He keyed the internal circuit with a shaking hand. "Pilot, recon. The Russian has opened his weapons bay. Repeat, weapons bay doors are open." Major Miller felt a cold spike of adrenaline. "Confirm. Is he carrying external ordnance?" the commander replied. "Negative. It is all internal. But the doors are wide open. He is showing us his teeth." The co-pilot checked the defensive systems panel. "Major, our radar warning receiver is completely dead. If he launches a short-range missile from that position, we will have zero warning. We are a sitting duck." Miller made a decision. He could not risk the lives of his crew on the hope that the Russian was bluffing. "We cannot stay in this formation. I am going to initiate an emergency brake. Turn to the left. Prepare for high G loads." 7:44 in the morning. The American pilot gripped the control yoke. He began to apply heavy pressure to the left, but the plane did not respond. It was as if the massive aircraft was frozen in a block of invisible ice. Miller looked at his co-pilot. His voice was tight with alarm. "The controls. They are locked. I cannot move the yoke." The co-pilot tried his own set of controls. He pulled with all his strength. Nothing. It is like the hydraulics are gone. But the pressure gauges are showing normal levels. Below them, Volkov was experiencing the exact same phenomenon. His Su-57 was no longer responding to his manual inputs. The fighter was locked in its position. It was perfectly centered under the American fuselage. The weapons bay doors remained stuck in the open position. Neither pilot had control of their engines. The throttles were frozen in place. The high-pitched whine in the cabins became a physical scream. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight into the human nervous system. 7:45 in the morning. The air outside the cockpits began to glow. A faint blue light surrounded the wingtips of both aircraft. It was not fire. It was not lightning. It was a static discharge of incredible intensity. The mission commander on the American plane looked down at his own hand. The hair on his arms was standing straight up. Small sparks began to jump between the metal racks of the electronic equipment. "Major, we have a massive power surge. Everything is going to blow." Miller looked out the front window. The purple sky of the Barents Sea was suddenly replaced by a wall of pure white light. The hum stopped. The vibration stopped. The world went black. 7:46 in the morning. The Barents Sea. The cockpit of the American RC-135 was a tomb of glass and dead plastic. Major Miller looked at his primary flight display. It was not flickering anymore. It was black. The electronic hum had vanished. It was replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. Miller pulled on the control yoke with both hands. It was frozen. He looked at his co-pilot. The man was staring at his own dead instruments in shock. They were 30,000 feet over the Barents Sea. They were flying a 100-ton glider. 7:47 in the morning. Inside the Russian fighter, Captain Volkov was trapped in a silent cockpit. His heads-up display was gone. His helmet-mounted sight was dark. He looked up through the canopy at the metal belly of the American plane. It was still there. The two aircraft were still locked together by a force they could not see. Volkov tried to cycle his manual backup systems. There was no power. The internal weapons bay doors remained open like a gaping wound. The missiles were visible on their racks, but they were as useless as stones. Volkov was a passenger in his own machine. 7:48 in the morning. At the Northern Fleet Command in Russia, the radar screen went blank. The merged dot was gone. The operator typed frantically on his keyboard. He checked his cables. He checked his power supply. "General, the target is lost. I have no primary or secondary return. It is as if the sky has closed." General Sokolov did not speak. He looked at the empty screen. He knew that two of the most advanced aircraft in the world did not simply vanish. He feared a collision. He feared the start of a war that neither side was ready to fight. 7:49 in the morning. At Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the situation was the same. The satellite link was severed. The tactical map showed a gray void over the Barents Sea. The colonel picked up the secure red phone. His voice was steady, but his eyes were fixed on the empty map. "We have a total loss of signal. Initiate search and rescue protocols. Prepare a flash message for the Pentagon. Assume a catastrophic mid-air event." 7:50 in the morning. Back in the sky, the two planes continued to move. They were not falling. The engines were still running at a steady thrust, but the pilots had no control over them. The throttles were physically stuck in their positions. It was as if the aircraft were being flown by a remote hand from another world. Major Miller looked out the side window. He saw the Russian fighter beneath his wing. He saw Captain Volkov looking up at him. Their eyes met for a brief second through the layers of glass and oxygen masks. In that moment, the uniform did not matter. The nationality did not matter. They were both terrified. 7:51 in the morning. The blue glow around the wings began to pulse. It moved with the slow rhythm of a heartbeat. Inside the RC-135, the mission commander walked toward the cockpit. He did not use the headset because the internal lines were dead. He spoke directly into Miller's ear. He spoke directly into Miller's ear. The radiation sensors in the back just peaked before they died. "This is not a jammer, Major. This is not human technology." 7:52 in the morning. The two pilots waited for the end. They expected the engines to explode. They expected the wings to snap under the pressure of the invisible force. They were over the most contested waters on Earth, and they were completely helpless. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like liquid. Every clock on both aircraft had stopped at the exact same second. 7:53 in the morning. The Barents Sea. The weight of the silence was broken by a sound that was not mechanical. It was a low, resonant chime. It seemed to come from the air itself. Inside the American cockpit, Major Miller felt a sudden sensation of lightness. The heavy vibration in the floorboards stopped. The aircraft was no longer fighting the wind. It was gliding through a vacuum. Miller looked at his hands. They were still gripped around the control yoke, but the yoke was moving on its own. It turned 10 degrees to the left. Then it centered. The massive RC-135 responded with a grace it did not possess. It moved like a bird, not a machine. Below the fuselage, Captain Volkov felt his Su-57 being lifted. It was not the lift of air over a wing. It was a magnetic pull. His fighter was drawn upward until the canopy was less than 5 meters from the American belly. He could see the individual scratches in the paint of the American plane. He could see the glass of the optical sensors. He tried to scream into his mask. No sound came out. The air in his lungs felt thick, like water. 7:54 in the morning. The clouds below the two aircraft began to swirl. They did not move with the wind. They formed a perfect, rotating circle that was miles wide. At the center of the circle, the dark water of the Barents Sea was visible, but the water was not dark anymore. It was glowing with the same pulsing blue light that covered the wings of the planes. A third object appeared. It did not come from the sea. It did not come from the sky. It simply was. It was a shape that defied military classification. It was a sliver of polished black material. It was perhaps 30 meters long. It was vertical, standing upright in the air like a needle. It moved toward the two aircraft with a speed that bypassed the laws of physics. It did not accelerate. It simply changed position. 7:55 in the morning. The black needle stopped 100 meters in front of the RC-135. Major Miller stared at it. It had no wings. It had no engines. It had no visible heat signature. It sat in the freezing Arctic air with a terrifying stability. The blue light on the wings of the American and Russian planes suddenly jumped. It flowed forward, forming two bright streams of energy that connected the aircraft to the black needle. Inside the RC-135, the mission commander watched the sparks on the equipment racks. They were no longer jumping at random. They were forming patterns. They were drawing geometric shapes on the metal surfaces. "Major," he whispered, "it is scanning us. It is reading the entire database." Miller could not respond. He watched as the black needle began to rotate. As it turned, the two aircraft were forced to turn with it. They were caught in a tractor beam of immense power. The Russian fighter and the American reconnaissance plane were being spun in a slow, silent circle around the unknown object. 7:56 in the morning. Captain Volkov looked at his instruments one last time. For a fraction of a second, the screens flickered to life. They did not show his fuel or his altitude. They showed a map of the Earth. It was not a modern map. The continents were shifted. The oceans were different. A single red dot pulsed in the center of the Barents Sea. Then the map vanished. It was replaced by a single line of Cyrillic text. It was a language Volkov recognized, but the dialect was ancient. It translated to a single word: enough. 7:57 in the morning. The black needle vanished. There was no flash. There was no sound. It was simply gone. The blue light on the wings dissolved into the gray morning air. The weight of the world returned. Major Miller felt the sudden, violent jolt of the engines as they regained their internal combustion. The control yoke kicked back against his palms with a force that nearly broke his wrists. Inside the Su-57, the roar of the twin engines returned like a physical blow. Captain Volkov was slammed back into his seat as the fighter's computer systems rebooted in a frenzy of alarms. The two aircraft were no longer locked together. They were tumbling through the sky in opposite directions. The 6 minutes of silence were over. The chaos was just beginning. 7:58 in the morning. The Barents Sea. The silence did not fade. It shattered. The interior of the RC-135 exploded with sound. Every warning tone in the cockpit triggered simultaneously. The fire loop alarms, the master caution, the ground proximity warning system. It was a cacophony of electronic screaming. Major Miller was slammed against his shoulder harness. The aircraft was in a steep bank to the left. The nose was dropping toward the dark water. He grabbed the control yoke with both hands. It was no longer frozen. It was vibrating with a violent, mechanical life. Miller shouted over the noise, "I have the aircraft! Leveling off! Leveling off!" The co-pilot was frantically flipping switches. Engine 1 is surging. Engine 4 is showing a flameout. We have a total electrical reset in progress. We have a total electrical reset in progress. Miller pulled the nose up. He felt the heavy resistance of the elevators. The plane groaned under the stress of the maneuver. "Give me max continuous thrust on 2 and 3. Disregard the alarms. Fly the plane." 7:59 in the morning. 1 mile away and 2,000 feet below, Captain Volkov was fighting for his life. His Su-57 was in a flat spin. The sky and the sea were a blurred gray streak through his canopy. His flight computer was rebooting. The screens were cycling through lines of green text at a blinding speed. Volkov stayed calm. He centered the stick. He applied opposite rudder. He waited for the fly-by-wire system to catch up with his commands. The Russian fighter snapped back into a level flight path. The engines roared as they reached full power. Volkov checked his weapons panel. The internal bay doors had slammed shut with such force that a warning light indicated a mechanical jam. His radar was sweeping the sky. It was filled with ghost contacts, hundreds of them. Volkov keyed his radio. "Center. This is Falcon 1. I have experienced a total systems failure. I am RTB. Repeat. I am returning to base." The radio crackled. A voice from Severomorsk came through. It was distorted, but recognizable. "Falcon 1, we see you. What is your status? What happened to the target?" Volkov looked out at the horizon. The RC-135 was a small dot climbing into the clouds. "The target is active. I believe they used an experimental electromagnetic pulse. The target is active. I believe they used an experimental electromagnetic pulse. My systems are compromised." 8:02 in the morning. Inside the American plane, the mission commander was checking his crew. No one was injured, but everyone was in a state of shock. The electronic racks in the back were smoking. The scent of burned insulation filled the cabin. He spoke into the internal line. "Pilot. Recon. We are blind. Every sensor is fried. We have no mission capability left. We need to get out of this sector now." Miller did not look back. He was watching his fuel gauges. "Copy that. We are heading for Norway. I am declaring an emergency." The co-pilot looked at Miller. His face was pale. "Major, did you see it?" Before the lights came back, Miller gripped the yoke tighter. "I saw a black shape. I saw the light. But the official report will say it was a Russian electronic warfare strike. But the official report will say it was a Russian electronic warfare strike. We do not talk about the rest. Not on an open line." 8:04 in the morning. The two aircraft were now moving away from each other. The distance between them grew to 10 miles, then 20. The Barents Sea was empty again. The rotating circle of clouds had vanished. The blue light was gone. At command centers in 2 different countries, officers stared at their screens. The blips were back. The world had not ended, but the data they were receiving made no sense. The clocks on both aircraft were exactly 6 minutes behind the rest of the world. The crews believed they had survived a secret war. They did not realize they had just been witnesses to something far older than their nations. 8:06 in the morning. The Barents Sea. The American aircraft was a wounded giant. Major Miller adjusted the trim for a shallow climb toward 32,000 feet. The vibration in the airframe had settled into a low, rhythmic thrum. It felt like the plane was shivering. Every few seconds, a spark would jump across the overhead panel. The smell of ozone and burnt copper was thick. Miller checked his wristwatch. Then he looked at the digital clock on the instrument panel. They did not match. The digital clock was exactly 6 minutes behind his mechanical watch. He looked at his co-pilot. The man was staring at his own wrist. "Major," the co-pilot said, "my watch says 8:12. The dash says 8:06. What happened to the time?" Miller did not answer. He keyed the long-range radio. "Magic Star. This is Python 1-1. We are exiting the sector. We have sustained internal damage. Requesting priority vector to Erland Air Base. We are declaring a state of emergency. The response from the American Command Center was immediate. Python 1-1. You are loud and clear. We have you on secondary radar. What is the nature of the interference? Did the Russian aircraft engage? Miller paused. He looked at the empty seat of the mission commander. Negative. Magic star. There was no kinetic engagement. We experienced a catastrophic electromagnetic event. The Russian interceptor was also affected. We are disengaging. 8:10 in the morning. Severomorsk Air Base, Russia. General Sokolov stood in front of the silent tactical map. The yellow dot representing Volkov's fighter was moving south. It was moving fast. The American blip was moving west, toward Norway. The crisis of a mid-air collision had passed, but a new crisis was beginning. Sokolov turned to his chief of intelligence. I want the flight data recorder from that Su-57 the moment it touches the tarmac. I want the pilot isolated. No one speaks to Volkov until I arrive. The intelligence officer nodded. General, the Americans are already moving. They have diverted 2 F-35 fighters from Norway to escort their plane. They think we hit them with a secret weapon. Sokolov gripped the edge of the table. We did not hit them. We were hit. Whatever happened out there silenced our most advanced fighter. If the Americans think we have this technology, they will escalate. If they realize we do not, they will wonder who does. 8:12 in the morning. The cockpit of the Su-57. Captain Volkov felt the cold air rushing through a seal in his canopy. The pressure was dropping. He had to stay low. He looked at his navigation screen. The map of the world was back to normal. The ancient Cyrillic text was gone. There was no trace of the word, enough. He reached for the record button. On his console, he wanted to report the visual contact with the black needle. He wanted to describe the blue light, but he hesitated. If he reported a floating black needle that defied physics, he would never fly again. They would call it high-altitude psychosis. They would say he cracked under the pressure of the intercept. He looked at the clock. 6 minutes were missing. He knew the investigators would find that gap. He could not hide the time, but he could hide the message. Volkov spoke into the encrypted channel. Command, this is Falcon 1. The American aircraft deployed a high-energy pulse. It disabled my primary flight systems. I am forced to return on backup power. The intercept is terminated. 8:15 in the morning. The border of international airspace. The RC-135 crossed the line into the Norwegian search and rescue zone. 2 gray shapes appeared on the horizon. The escort fighters from Erland had arrived. They took positions on the wings of the limping reconnaissance plane. Major Miller looked out the window at the F-35 pilots. They were giving him the thumbs up. They saw a routine emergency. They saw a plane that had survived a close call with a Russian jet. They did not see the burnt geometric patterns on the floorboards. They did not know about the 6 minutes that had been stolen from the world. Miller leaned back in his seat. His hands were finally starting to stop shaking. The sky was clear. The Barents Sea was a sheet of blue glass. It looked peaceful. It looked empty. Co-pilot, Miller said. Yes, sir? Keep the flight logs exactly as the computer recorded them. Do not adjust for the time gap. Let the analysts figure it out. The mission was over. The 2 nations would spend the next decade accusing each other of a crime that neither had committed. The truth was far more silent. The morning was bright. The secret was safe. 3 days later, Washington, District of Columbia. The conference room in the basement of the Pentagon was windowless. The air was cool and smelled of filtered oxygen. A group of 10 men and women sat around a mahogany table. They were the highest-level electronic warfare analysts in the United States. In front of them were the flight data recorders from the RC-135. A brigadier general stood at the head of the table. He tapped a glass screen. We have run the forensics 4 times. There is no evidence of a microwave pulse. There is no trace of a high-energy laser. The copper wiring in the fuselage did not melt. It was reorganized. An analyst leaned forward. Reorganized? What does that mean, sir? The general looked at a microscopic image on the screen. The molecular structure of the wiring was altered. It was turned into a series of perfect geometric patterns. The equipment did not burn out because of heat. It stopped working because the physics of the electricity changed for 360 seconds. The room was silent. The general continued. And then there is the time gap. Every clock on that aircraft lost exactly 6 minutes. The GPS satellites recorded the plane as a stationary point in space during that window. It did not hover. It did not glide. According to the satellites, it ceased to exist as a moving object. 3 days later, Moscow, Russia. General Sokolov sat in a private dacha outside the city. He was holding a physical file. It was the only copy in existence. Inside were the transcripts from Captain Volkov's debriefing. Sokolov looked at the man sitting across from him. It was Volkov. The pilot looked tired. His eyes were bloodshot. He had been questioned for 72 hours straight. Sokolov spoke softly. "You told the investigators it was an American weapon. You told them you saw a blue light and then blacked out." Volkov nodded. "Yes, General. That is what I told them." Sokolov leaned closer. "But you did not tell them about the screen. You did not tell them about the map. Or the word." Volkov froze. He looked at the general. "I do not know what you mean, sir." Sokolov pulled a small thermal printout from the file. The Su-57 has a deep buffer emergency recorder. It captures the raw data sent to the glass displays. It bypasses the main computer. "We found it, Captain. We saw the map. We saw the word enough in ancient Slavic." Volkov looked down at his hands. "I thought I was hallucinating. I thought the Americans were playing with my mind." Sokolov shook his head. "The Americans are terrified. Our intelligence says they are tearing their plane apart, looking for a weapon that does not exist. They think we did this. We think they did this. But you and I know the truth." "What is the truth, sir?" Volkov asked. Sokolov looked out the window at the falling snow. "The truth is that we have become too loud. We are playing with fire in a house we do not own. Something in that sea decided to turn off the lights. It was a warning. It was a demonstration of a power that makes our stealth fighters look like paper planes." The general stood up. He walked to a fireplace and dropped the file into the flames. "The official report will say it was a mutual electronic malfunction caused by a solar flare. Neither nation will admit they were helpless. We will continue our patrols. We will continue our games. But the Barents Sea is no longer a battlefield. It is a cage." 5 days after the encounter. The Barents Sea. The water was dark and cold. High above, the sky was a deep, empty blue. There were no planes in the air. For the first time in a generation, the sector was quiet. Deep beneath the surface, a faint blue light pulsed once. It was not the light of a ship. It was not the light of a submarine. It was the heartbeat of something that had been there before the first radar was built. It was something that would be there long after the last missile was fired. The mystery of the 6 minutes would never be solved. It would become a ghost story told by pilots in dark bars. It would be a footnote in a classified archive. Modern warfare is a game of technology and speed. But on that morning, 2 nations learned a different lesson. They learned that the most advanced weapons in the world can be silenced by a single thought. The Arctic was silent again. The lesson was over.